Good afternoon, everyone. I know this is going to be a tough session after lunch. My goodness. Hope you don't fall asleep. But hope you have some coffee with you. Well, it's really an honor to be here in your midst today. I'm going to be talking about Africa's growth and position in the global economy. And the key message that I want to share with all of you today is that to achieve prosperity, equity, and stability, African countries must industrialize their economies. But during this process of transformation, they will have to navigate a more turbulent global economy fraught with geopolitical tensions. In sharing this message today, my presentation will have 4 key components. The first thing I want to talk about is how Africa is the global economy's last mile of development. Then I'm going to talk about how Africa will and is experiencing challenges of structural transformation in a more turbulent global economy. Then I will try to I'll try to talk about ways to identify and harness the continent's leverage. And then I will conclude with a discussion on how Africa can navigate this more turbulent global economy as it seeks to transform its economy or economies. Starting with the first component, Africa as the global economy's last mile of global development. Now, let us begin by looking at the growth projections for the year 2025 by the IMF. The global economy is expected to grow at a muted rate of 2.8% this year. Africa is expected to grow at a slightly higher rate of 3.8%, which is going to make it the second fastest growing region in the world after Asia. When you dig a bit deeper, you find that actually 13 of the world's 20 fastest growing economies in 2025 are expected to be in Africa. There's a wide range of countries, including countries just emerging out of conflict or still in some conflict. We're talking about Libya, Ethiopia, Cote d'Ivoire. A lot of low-income countries, Niger Republic, Benin Republic, Uganda, and a number of middle-income economies. So you could argue that maybe they are starting from a low base, and that's why they're going to experience a minimum growth rate of around 6%. But I know there are also countries around the world that are dying for a 3% growth rate, so this is not too bad. But when you start to dig a bit deeper beyond the surface of growth projections, you find that the picture is actually a lot less rosy. Because in fact, 22 of the world's 26 low-income countries, classified by the World Bank as having per capita incomes of less than $1,100, are in Africa. And in fact, the continent's gross national income per capita, which is usually the measure for income, is lower than every other emerging region. We're talking about East Asia, South Asia, Latin America and the Caribbean, and so on. When we look at another metric, which is manufacturing value added, both as a share of GDP and its contribution to employment, we find that, again, Africa is probably not doing as well as we would like. In aggregate, manufacturing value added as a share of GDP, according to UNIDO, in Africa is at around 10%, which is much lower than the global average of around 16%. Also, Africa's share of total global manufacturing, and I don't have the number here, is around 2%. Compare that with the fact that the continent comprises 17% of the world's population. And then the manufacturing sector's share or contribution to employment on the continent is around 7%. Of course, there are variations, including South Africa here, which has a fairly large and fairly developed manufacturing sector, Morocco, and a few other countries. But otherwise, a lot of countries are they just don't have well-developed manufacturing sectors. Another indicator that I want to put on the table here today for our discussion is global poverty. Global poverty in terms of the number of people living below a certain poverty line is increasingly concentrated in the African continent. In fact, you find that Africa is the only emerging region right now where more than 40% of the population lives in extreme poverty. Other regions of the world that had such a high incidence of poverty, East Asia in particular, South Asia, they're seeing rapid declines in the share of people living below the poverty line. And in fact, the fear by many economists is that by 2030, global poverty could become distinctly African, just because other regions of the world are making much faster progress in eradicating poverty and destitution. Now, coming to the second part of my presentation today, I want to talk about how a more turbulent global economy makes the challenge of structural transformation even more difficult for Africa. Not impossible, but even more difficult. And there are a couple of trends that I want to tease out that characterize this turbulence in the global economy. The first is that we're seeing a trend of fragmentation. You know, if you think of the concept of globalization and how for the past maybe 60 years, some would argue that for the past 100 years plus since the Industrial Revolution, some would go even further and say for the past, 500 years, there has been a trend of greater integration with the lowering of barriers to the mobility of capital, labor, people, and ideas. However, that the speed of that mobility is slowing down. If you look at certain indicators like trade as a share of GDP, its growth rate, by some measures, has kind of stagnated, for the past maybe 5-7 years. So for that reason, the International Monetary Fund, in its World Economic Outlook for April 2023, identified a trend of geoeconomic fragmentation, in which, by certain measures in certain domains, we are seeing that parts of the world are decoupling and separating with respect to technology, with respect to financial flows, and also with respect to trade. And in fact, it looks like our global economy might be splintering into 3 or maybe 4 super regions. A North America super region, mostly led by the United States, a European super region, mostly led by the European Union, an Asia-Pacific super region, mostly led by China, and then the rest of the world will have to figure it out. I really encourage you to read that report, and there are more papers coming out with respect to geoeconomics and geoeconomic fragmentation. This fragmentation is being driven by a number of factors, one being the changing nature of domestic politics in advanced economies, with quite a number of democracies shifting rightward politically. A second driver is geopolitical tensions among the major powers. You think about US, China, increasingly US, EU, surprise, surprise. Within Europe, EU, Russia, China, EU, and then also the middle powers. We are also seeing rising trade protectionism, and I'll talk about that in more detail in the next couple of slides. And then finally, the lingering effects of the shocks of COVID-19, particularly the realization among many countries that certain industries have to be deemed as strategic. Remember when we're all hustling for masks and hand sanitizers? I can tell you for a fact that in DC, it was very difficult to get masks in the beginning of the pandemic. You had to go underground and, pay double, triple to get hand sanitizers. But on a serious note, industries like pharmaceuticals, certain aspects of energy supply chains, certain aspects of digital technologies were suddenly deemed to be strategic. And and that is still lingering today. Another trend that is characterizing this turbulence in the global economy is that there are now a lot of uncertainties in the flow of development finance to low and middle income countries, particularly in Africa. The African continent has an annual financing gap of around $400 billion every year until 2030 to be able to meet the sustainable development goals and to achieve a just energy transition. This is according to the African Development Bank. But the ability to close this gap is complicated, to say the very least, by the fact that there is now a declining trend in the flow of foreign aid and concessional development finance. In an analysis that we did last year, we found that as of October 2024, 8 out of the 10 largest donors in the OECD DAC, this is the Development Assistance Committee, the group of traditional donors, had announced plans to cut their aid budgets. As of April this year, there were further announcements made to the cutting of aid budgets. Germany, the United Kingdom, Netherlands, France, Italy, Sweden, and on and on and on. And notably in the United States, since January of this year, the government of President Donald Trump has made sweeping changes to the world of U.S. development assistance, culminating in the complete dismantling of the world's largest development agency, USAID. It has now functionally ceased to exist, with more than 80% of its programs and projects terminated, and nearly all of its 10,000 staff, likely to be let go of within the next couple of weeks. Another trend that I want to talk about, I already alluded to it a little bit earlier, but I want to zoom in a little bit more, is that there are now rising barriers to global trade. And we're seeing barriers being erected by both advanced economies with a lot of tariffs to imports, and also middle-income economies which tend to use the mechanism of export bans, banning the export of critical, crucial commodities, products, intermediate input, etc. These barriers pose a threat to the ability of African countries to access export markets. It's absolutely essential to be able to access export markets if a country wants to pursue export-oriented industrialization, because this is the known pathway to achieving industrialization, at least within the last couple of decades. Let's zoom in on the US a little bit here. In April 2nd, specifically, for those of us living in Washington, D.C., we were told it was Liberation Day, in which it was a day in which the president announced tariffs on imports from over 190 countries. These tariffs were divided into two categories. One category was a blanket 10% on imports, merchandise imports specifically, from most trading partners of the United States, and then reciprocal tariffs that range from 11% to 50% to be applied to imports from 57 countries, 21 of which are in Africa, as illustrated on the right-hand side of the slide. Now, there are all sorts of negotiations happening. There are exemptions here and there on hydrocarbons, critical minerals, some aspects of pharmaceuticals, smartphones, electronics, and the tariffs are yet to be implemented. Implementation will begin on the 8th of July. Now, the key question for a lot of African countries is, will they be able to access the U.S. market after July 8th? And what is the future of the African Growth and Opportunity Act? Something we can discuss a little bit later. With respect to Europe, The European Union is implementing the carbon border adjustment mechanism. I think implementation has begun, or it's going to be kind of fully underway by next year. In any case, this is meant to keep out goods, products manufactured through carbon-intensive processes. But there are many countries that argue that this is a way to keep competitive imports out of the European Union. And there are now, I think, cases at the World Trade Organization on this front. Because for many countries, including countries beyond Africa, they feel that this penalizes their exports. There are estimates by the London School of Economics that the full implementation of CBAM could cost the African continent of up to $25 billion of GDP. And then finally, with respect to China, in December of 2024, China began to implement duty-free access to its market for exports from the world's, I think, 44 least developed countries, 33 of which are in Africa. The problem is, with this trade preference program, it only applies to least developed countries, right? Mostly low-income, fragile countries, meaning that middle-income economies in Africa, Nigeria, Kenya, etc., may find it difficult to access this particular program. Now, when you put together these three separate initiatives, I mean, there are also other things going on elsewhere, but these are just three examples. You find that for the African continent, market access for exports looks like it's going to be very, very difficult. This is not just a theoretical question. Manufacturing investment coming from elsewhere would land or would arrive in an African country with the expectation that you can manufacture for export. Economists have called this flying geese, the expectation that manufacturing investment, particularly for kind of low-wage, low-skilled manufacturing, would move from Asia to Africa. But if African manufacturers cannot access export markets, then there's a huge question around prospects for industrialization. Another trend I want to quickly talk about, and I'm sure you're very familiar with this, it's a very sexy topic these days, is the rising demand for minerals and metals to power the industries of the 21st century. But before we go into detail, it's quite important to take a step back here to remember that Africa's natural resources have been quite critical to the transformation of the global economy, at least since the end of World War II, maybe as far back as the Industrial Revolution. Some would even argue that as far back as a couple of centuries. So it looks like Africa's natural resources, hydrocarbons, back in the post-World War II era, minerals, commodities, are set to reprise an important role in the industries of the 21st century. What are these industries? Renewable energy industries, electric mobility industries, but also the defense industry increasingly. These are all industries that are putting out various kinds of hardware that require certain kinds of minerals as input. Whether we're talking about lithium or nickel or cobalt, copper, manganese, rare earths, graphite, etc. And some of these minerals are found on the African continent. And we know that demand for them is going to grow exponentially over the next decade or two. With this rise in demand, there's already a scramble for these minerals and for these resources. And some of the scramble is really focused on Africa as some kind of theater. Scramble by the major powers, China, the US, the European Union, but also by the middle powers, India, South Korea, Japan, countries in the Persian Gulf. Now let's zoom in on the US specifically here. Every 2 or 3 years, the US Geological Survey puts together a list of about 50 minerals and metals that are considered to be critical. The last list, I think, was put together in 2022, And at least 10 of the 50 critical minerals, for those 10, the US has an import dependence of between 50 to 100%. The imports mostly come in from China, even though the minerals are not necessarily found in China. So some of these minerals are found in abundance in Africa: cobalt, manganese, tin, graphite, titanium, etc. But zooming out beyond the United States, when you look at some of the trade data, you start to see the kind of geopolitical competition playing out. When we did this analysis back in 2022, we looked at China-Africa trade in minerals and metals, and at the time it amounted to around $50 billion. US-Africa trade for the same commodities amounted to around $5 billion, which is 10%. And then EU-Africa trade, same commodities, around $19 billion. And I know when we did the analysis, we had a chart, and people were going crazy about it. It was very stark. China, the graph was this way, the US was this way, the EU was kind of on a steady ascending pace. And the final trend has to do with artificial intelligence and digital technologies. Now, there are so many facets and dimensions here with respect to how AI and digital technologies, cloud computing, 3D printing, robotics, etc., are transforming entire industries, whether we're talking about hospitality, mobility, etc. But specifically what I want to talk about here and highlight is the fact that these digital technologies are also transforming the factory floor. Again, when we think about industrialization, particularly the jobs intensity and labor intensity of manufacturing, huge questions around whether even if Africa is able to attract manufacturing FDI, even if Africa has access to export markets, will those manufacturing industries generate enough jobs that are needed? Huge question mark. The third component of my presentation has to do with mentioning the necessity of identifying and harnessing the continent's leverage. And there are a couple of key points here. First is Africa's demographics. These are familiar numbers, I'm sure, to most of you. The continent is the youngest and has the youngest and fastest growing population. 50%, more than 50% of the world's projected growth in population will be concentrated in 8 countries, 5 of which are in Africa: DRC, Ethiopia, Egypt, Nigeria, Tanzania. And then there are 13 to 15 million people joining the labor market each year, according to the International Labour Organization. And most of these people, young people in particular, end up in low-wage, low-skilled jobs in agriculture, petty trade, and other aspects of the informal economy. So this is something to keep in mind as a potential leverage for Africa. Another source of leverage, potentially, a lot of this is potential right now, needs to be activated, is the continent size. This is a continent comprised of 54 countries. These 54 countries could both be a powerful political bloc and a powerful economic bloc. Already, the continent is a fairly powerful political bloc in the UN system. A good friend of mine worked at the UN Security Council, and I got to learn that the permanent 5 members actively court the Africa group because it's the largest bloc. So this is a powerful source of leverage. Then as an economic bloc, obviously the African Continental Free Trade Area, once fully implemented, is going to make Africa the world's largest free trade area by number of participants. 54 countries. Another potential source of leverage is natural resources. We already discussed the minerals and metals. Of course, natural gas, oil reserves as well. And then having the largest tropical forest carbon sink in the Congo Basin. And of course, a continent endowed with around 65% of the world's arable land and 10% of its renewable freshwater resources. Finally, there is a growing global interest in engagement with Africa by the major powers and the middle powers, and this is spurred on by a number of factors, whether it's the desire for accessing a hypothetical integrated market of, close to 2 billion people, or the natural resources that we've spoken about, or for helping position those specific countries during this great power competition that is already happening. And for that reason, we've seen that various countries have been unveiling Africa strategies. Canada just unveiled its Africa strategy a couple of weeks ago. The US is going to work, or is currently working on an Africa strategy that may or may not be published. The UK, France put out an Africa strategy, although I think we're writing that right now. But also, there are now Africa +1 summits that are being convened by these countries. Since 2020, there have been at least 10 of such summits in which a country convenes at the highest levels, African countries, at the level of the president or the prime minister, as the US-Africa Summit, the China Forum on China-Africa Cooperation, Russia-Africa Summit, Saudi-Africa Summit, on and on and on and on. The final component of my presentation is that I think the key message that Africa will need to utilize this leverage to be able to navigate a more turbulent global economy in order to achieve this difficult task of structural economic transformation. And I would argue that the key priority for a lot of African countries right now, and based on what we've learned from economic history of how countries in East Asia and elsewhere made that transition, is that they need to have a laser focus on catalyzing sustained double-digit economic growth rates. And to achieve that, I would argue that there are two main sets of priorities. Governance reform priorities that are meant to catalyze growth, not generic governance reform for the sake of governance reform, and also certain kinds of investment priorities. Governance reforms, digitization of government services, whether it's land titling, licenses, business registration, these need to be made easier and quicker. Plug-in revenue leakages, very, very important, especially because there's now decline in foreign aid. Governments will need to think about maintaining, retaining every cent, every shilling, every rand, every naira, and so on and so forth. Preventing capital flight, very, very important. The continent is estimated to lose around $90 billion every year in illicit financial flows from elite corruption, from tax-evading multinationals. But there's also another factor here, which I think is what distinguishes many African countries from a lot of East Asian countries, that there's also legitimate capital that is just not incentivized to invest domestically. So those incentives need to be created. Maybe sometimes, governments also need to carry a little bit of a big stick, but they should create the incentives first for capital to invest domestically, and then easing barriers to intercontinental travel. We've all seen video clips of Aliko Dangote, the industrialist in Nigeria, complaining about how he can't travel across Africa easily. And then investment priorities, we know the basic stuff: growth enabling infrastructure, energy, transportation, digital infrastructure. But I want to emphasize on locally led knowledge generation platforms. This is so crucial because the very framework within which African governments, and I would say some African businesses, operate is not shaped and defined by African intellectuals. There needs to be more investment in Africa-led knowledge generation platforms, including research institutes, as well as business accelerators. This is my last slide. I know I'm out of time. Dynamic diplomatic engagement is absolutely critical. Sitting in Washington, D.C., I know that a lot of African missions are poorly equipped and under-resourced compared to their counterparts from Europe, from Asia, from the Middle East. There needs to be more equipped and resourced diplomatic missions, particularly in the G7 countries, and then maybe in international organizations. African countries need to forge common continental positions on key areas. It's impossible to think that African countries, all 54 of them, are going to agree on every single issue all the time. But there needs to be a prioritization of key issues like critical minerals. Why is there no functioning coordinating agency by the African Union on critical minerals in Africa? Energy security, climate finance, appoint a special envoy who can represent African interests in global fora, those kinds of things. And then finally, it's important to leverage relationships, particularly with middle powers, whether it's a South Korea, whether it's in India, whether it's in Brazil, on certain aspects of tech and R&D partnerships, and also partnerships with companies. This is the final message I want to leave you all with, that the main development challenge for Africa is structural transformation, which will generate all the benefits that we would want to see on the continent: prosperity, equity, stability. But this challenge is even more difficult because industrialization will have to happen within a more turbulent and increasingly hostile global economy. Thank you very much.
Your questions, I'll be able to get through them. And I would add to your point around the global reorientation towards the continent, the fact that the African Union has now officially been recognized within the G20 is something that happened, I think, around 2 years ago. You mentioned a lot of wonderful things, and I loved your emphasis on the leverage that the African continent does have. It reminded me of a particular conversation that did take place in the White House where a particular president was reminded about who has the cards. And I think that in these negotiations, we can proudly stand and say that we do have some cards. We've got cards when it does come to critical minerals. We do hold the cards when it does come to the youth demographic and the future workforce. We've got the cards when it also comes to the geographic size of the continent. I think that that was another element that you mentioned. But you raised a question around AGOA, and you said that you'll answer it. And so for many, right now we're looking at a 10% baseline, right, on tariffs. So tariffs are still there. And some have questioned whether the imposition of tariffs on the African continent means that AGOA is effectively dead. Different views? What's yours?
Well, on AGOA, never say never, in the sense that things are not looking good. But because we're in such a fluid environment where everything is up for negotiation, AGOA is not yet dead. It's probably on its deathbed.
Sure.
But everything is up for negotiation. This is why understanding Africa's leverage and being very organized to make a compelling case of a transaction and mutual benefits might be the key to saving AGOA.
Miracles do happen, but to the tail end of that question, is the AFCFTA then Africa's savior, in your view?
In the future, yes, when it's fully implemented. The problem is we're not there yet. There are kind of many processes and, technical processes that need to happen around protocols on different aspects of trade. The other thing is just with the sheer size of the African continent, that the fact that you have a variety of countries with different starting points at different income levels, different industries that they feel that maybe they need to protect. It makes implementation challenging. I know one argument that has been put forward is that maybe different sub-regions need to focus on kind of sub-regional integration first before we're able to have a fully functioning Africa continental free trade area.
Capital flight, mentioned in your presentation as well. How does one prevent capital, or how does preventing capital flight rather relate to reducing or eliminating exchange controls? Not sure if you've got a thought on that one. It's a big one.
It's a big one. It's very complicated, and I don't know if there's there's one solution for every country. Perhaps one provocative thought that I'm going to put on the table would be that I think for a country that is probably like middle income or upper middle income with kind of fairly developed capital markets, then I could see them potentially considering, and maybe with fairly developed infrastructure, there are opportunities to invest domestically because you do have a liquid capital market. Then maybe there could be a case to be made for certain kinds of exchange rate controls. But for a very low-income country where perhaps the domestic economy is not as well developed, I don't know, then that just becomes very complicated. And countries have tried it, by the way, and failed on that front. Yeah.
Sure. Industrialization, just touching on your presentation as well, there's a question as to how can Africa ever compete with China, and not even argue Asia from a manufacturing point of view. Did you know that the Ivory Coast, it exports around 80% of its cashews to Vietnam, who then exports 60% of those cashews to the rest of us? Because Ivory Coast can't process their cashews. Coffee, chocolate, we can name the list. But do we stand a fighting chance as a continent to level up our manufacturing?
I would say yes. Let me start with an anecdote that I'm sure a lot of people know of. At the end of the day, a country can always be as ambitious as possible. In the mid-20th century when South Korea was a very poor country, I don't want to use the word low income, very poor country with people, and I don't mean this with disrespect, but people were still defecating on the streets. South Korea decided we want to build a shipbuilding industry. People laughed at them. Today, they have, the world's second largest shipbuilding industry, if not the largest. So what I'm trying to say here is that it's absolutely the role of leaders to think big and to be ambitious. And certain decisions have to be made at the political level, but they also have to be backed up by action. I'm not sure the objective is to compete with China. I don't know if any country can compete with China in terms of scale, in terms of skilled labor, but there are industries, certain kinds of activities that countries can choose to specialize in. So when you talk to a lot of Chinese entrepreneurs and you ask them, how can African countries go about with this whole industrialization business, they would tell you, maybe the key thing, particularly for a low-income country, is you start with a one component, right? If we're talking about solar panels, you don't try to manufacture the entire, end-user product or a battery. You start with one tiny component. Maybe it's the screw, maybe it's the plastic. And then there are certain political decisions that can be made around, are you going to make cheap electricity available, cheap credit available? Can you think about linking that particular industry with your knowledge and skills building entities domestically? That is how you kind of build up those capabilities. Not necessarily with the objective of competing with the best to begin with, but you just have to start somewhere.
I think you also draw on the lesson that was communicated by our Deputy Finance Minister a little bit earlier when it does come to how we're approaching reform as a country. One of the lessons, you'll remember what he said, is that focusing on, a few things, one or two things, as opposed to trying to do everything at one time, not really effective. But Dr. Zainab, there's several other questions that have come through regarding the role of the AU and how it can be leveled up, and also regarding speaking in one voice. You mentioned some of the disparity that you did observe in Washington, particularly maybe resource-driven. I'm hoping that you'll still be around during the tea break specifically for the individuals who did pose that question to approach you.
Sure.
But for now, ma'am, thank you so much for taking the time to grace us with your knowledge at this conference.